For millennia, one book has echoed through the corridors of human history. It is not merely a book, it is a library, a collection of scrolls, letters, laws, poems, and prophecies, written by dozens of authors in 3 different languages, on 3 separate continents, across a span of more than 1,500 years.
It has been the bedrock of empires and the fire of revolutions. It has inspired the world's most transcendent art, the music of Bach, the paintings of Michelangelo, the cathedrals of Europe. It has also been used to justify its darkest acts, devastating wars, brutal inquisitions, and the chains of slavery. It is the most revered, most published, and most influential text in human history. It is also, in the 21st century, the most debated, dissected, and doubted. We call it the Bible.
But in an age of science and skepticism, what are we to make of this ancient library? How did it come to be? Who actually wrote the words that have shaped our world? Was it God? Was it Moses? Was it a committee of priests? Was it a group of fishermen? And perhaps the most critical question of all, in a modern world, how can we possibly know if this collection of ancient texts is reliable? This is not a journey to prove or disprove faith. This is a historical, archaeological, and literary investigation. We are not seeking a simple answer, but a profound understanding. We will deconstruct the very origins of the Old Testament, uncovering a complex hypothesis that shattered centuries of tradition. We will hunt for the true authors of the Gospels, chasing the faint echoes of an oral tradition and a lost, hypothetical super-document. And finally, we will put the Bible to the test. We will examine the hard evidence, the ancient manuscripts, the carbon dating, and the stunning archaeological discoveries emerging from the dust, discoveries that have both challenged and in some cases shockingly confirmed the biblical narrative. This is the story of where the Bible truly came from, the hidden history of who really wrote it, and the evidence for why, or if, it can still be trusted. Our story begins here, in the ancient Near East, with the foundation of the Bible, known to Jews as the Tanakh and to Christians as the Old Testament. For centuries, the answer to who wrote it was simple, taught to billions of children across the globe. God dictated it to Moses on Mount Sinai. This tradition holds that Moses himself wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books, known as the Torah or the Pentateuch, are the absolute bedrock of the entire biblical story. And yet, almost immediately, this tradition runs into problems. Problems found within the text itself. The text of Genesis 12 mentions the Canaanites in the land. This sounds like a narrator writing at a later time, when the Canaanites were no longer there. Deuteronomy 34 describes in vivid detail the death and burial of Moses. How could he have written his own obituary? The text even says, "No one knows his burial place to this day." That phrase, "to this day," is an instant red flag for historians. It implies a narrator looking back from a great distance in time. For centuries, these were just curiosities,
But in the 19th century, a new generation of German scholars began to look closer. They noticed something else, something profound. The text was not one continuous voice, it was four. They discovered that the Torah was not a book, it was a tapestry. This is the documentary hypothesis. It is the most important theory for understanding the Old Testament, and it changes everything. It proposes that the first 5 books are a masterful synthesis of at least 4 distinct independent sources woven together by a later editor or redactor. These sources are known as J, E, D, and P. First, there is J. Scholars call this source J because it uses the personal, covenant name for God, Yahweh, or Yahweh in German. The J source is the great storyteller. It's believed to be the oldest source, written perhaps in the 10th or 9th century BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah. Its God is deeply personal, almost human. This is the God who walks with Adam in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day, the God who forms man from dust with his own hands, the God who bargains with Abraham over the fate of Sodom. J is responsible for the second creation story in Genesis 2, the story of the fall, and much of the epic narrative of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's earthy, vivid, and psychological. Next is E. E is named for its preferred name for God, Elohim. This source is believed to have originated in the northern kingdom of Israel around the 9th or 8th century BCE. The God of E is more distant, more transcendent. He doesn't appear in person. He communicates through dreams, visions, and angelic messengers. It is in the E source that God speaks to Moses from a burning bush. It is E that gives us the story of Jacob's ladder and the famous test of Abraham's faith, the binding of Isaac. Historians believe that after the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by Assyria in 722 BCE, refugees fled south to Judah, bringing their sacred E scrolls with them. A brilliant scribe then combined J and E, weaving their 2 parallel histories into a single, richer narrative. This is why Genesis sometimes tells the same story twice, back to back, with slightly different details. Then came D. D stands for the Deuteronomist. The story shifts to Jerusalem, 622 BCE. The young King Josiah is reforming the nation. During renovations of the temple, the high priest finds a long-lost scroll, the Book of the Law. This book, which scholars identify as the core of Deuteronomy, is a theological explosion. D is passionate, rhetorical, and urgent. Its message is simple: one God, one temple, one covenant. D demands absolute loyalty to Yahweh and the centralization of all worship in Jerusalem. It's a fiery sermon, a call for national renewal. The D source also shapes the narrative of the historical books that follow: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This Deuteronomistic history interprets the entire rise and fall of Israel through one lens. Did the king obey the covenant of D? If yes, victory. If no, disaster. Finally, there is P. P is the priestly source. The year is 587 BCE. King Josiah's reforms have failed. Babylon has conquered Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed. The elite of Judah are dragged into exile in Babylon. This is a crisis of faith.
Their God has been defeated. Their nation is gone. A group of priests, the P source, responds not with a sermon, but with order. The priestly source is obsessed with ritual, law, liturgy, and genealogies. P is the source that gives us the majestic 7-day creation story in Genesis 1, a story not about how the world was made, but why. It's a story that establishes the cosmos as a divine temple, culminating in the Sabbath. P gives us the laws in Leviticus, the blueprints for the tabernacle, and the long family trees that tie the nation back to Adam. P is writing to preserve a shattered people, to create a temple of text that they can carry with them in exile.
The documentary hypothesis reveals that the Torah was not written by a single man in the desert, but was forged in the fires of history over centuries by a nation struggling to understand its God. But the Old Testament is more than just the Torah. We have the Nevi'im, or the prophets, figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. These were not just fortune tellers. They were radical social critics, poets, and political dissidents who spoke truth to power, warning kings that their failure to care for the poor and the orphan would lead to national collapse. And we have the Ketuvim, or the writings. This is the most diverse collection. The beautiful, emotional poetry of the Psalms, the practical, earthy wisdom of Proverbs, and the philosophical masterpiece, the Book of Job, which confronts the eternal question of why good people suffer and refuses to give an easy answer.
And then there are the lost books. If you open a Catholic or Orthodox Bible, you will find books that Protestant Bibles don't have. Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These are the Apocrypha, or deuterocanonical books. These texts were written in the centuries between the Old and New Testaments. They were included in the Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was the Bible used by many early Christians. Centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation, figures like Martin Luther sought to return to the original Hebrew canon. Since these books were not in the official Hebrew collection, he moved them to a separate section, and eventually they were dropped from Protestant Bibles altogether. The Old Testament, we find, is not a monolith. It is an evolving, expanding, and profoundly human library, compiled over 1,000 years. But the story was not finished. A new figure was about to walk onto the stage of history in a remote province of the Roman Empire, a figure who would write nothing, yet would inspire the most influential texts the world has ever known.
We've just journeyed through 1,500 years to see how this incredible library was built. We've untangled the threads of J, E, D, and P. We've met the authors of the Gospels, and we've walked the Roman roads with the Apostle Paul. But now we come to the most important question of all. It's a complex history, so how do we know we can trust any of it?
We are about to dive into the hard evidence, the science, the archaeology, and the manuscripts that underpin the Bible's reliability. This is the foundation of everything. If you are finding value in this deep historical investigation, if you believe these are questions worth asking, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Join us as we continue to unlock the greatest mysteries of history. Okay, let's talk about reliability.
The New Testament is the story of a revolution, a Jewish messianic movement that exploded out of Judea and within 3 centuries conquered the Roman Empire that crucified its founder. That founder, Jesus of Nazareth,
wrote nothing. This is the central problem of the New Testament. The source of the entire religion was an oral teacher. He spoke in Aramaic, telling parables and proclaiming the kingdom of God. After his death and the belief in his resurrection, his followers did not immediately write a book. They preached a message. This was an oral culture. For 30 or 40 years, the stories of Jesus' life, his teachings, and his death were passed from person to person, from village to village. This is the oral tradition, or kerygma. But as the first eyewitnesses began to die, and as the message spread to new cities, a new need arose to write it down.
This brings us to the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For centuries, they were believed to be written by their namesakes: Matthew, the tax collector; Mark, the companion of Peter; Luke, the physician; and John, the beloved disciple. But modern scholarship reveals a more complex picture. The Gospels were written anonymously. The titles, Gospel according to Mark, were added in the 2nd century as the Church tried to attribute these texts to authoritative apostolic figures. And when scholars laid the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, side by side, they discovered a literary puzzle. They are so similar, often using the exact same Greek words in the exact same order, that they must be copying from each other. This is the synoptic problem. Synoptic means seen together, and solving it unlocks the secret of who wrote the Gospels.
The solution, accepted by the vast majority of scholars, is called Markan priority. The Gospel of Mark was the first one written around 65 to 70 CE, possibly in Rome, during or just after the Jewish-Roman War. Mark is short, breathless, and urgent. His Greek is simple, sometimes even rough. Jesus is a man of action, a mysterious exorcist, and a suffering Messiah. Mark famously begins not with a virgin birth, but with Jesus as an adult, striding out of the desert. A decade or two later, around 80-90 CE, 2 other authors wrote their own Gospels. We call them Matthew and Luke. And we know, with near certainty, that both Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark's Gospel open in front of them as they wrote. They both use Mark as their foundational narrative. They borrow his stories, his structure, and even his exact phrasing. But they also change Mark. Matthew, writing for a deeply Jewish audience, cleans up Mark's rough Greek and works tirelessly to show Jesus as the new Moses, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. It is Matthew who gives us the Sermon on the Mount and the virgin birth from Joseph's perspective. Luke, a sophisticated Hellenistic writer, also uses Mark, but he is writing for a non-Jewish or Gentile audience. He presents Jesus as the Savior for all humanity. Luke gives us the Christmas story from Mary's perspective, the parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, and the companion volume, the Acts of the Apostles. But this solves only half the puzzle. Matthew and Luke also share over 200 verses of material that are not in Mark. This material consists almost entirely of Jesus' sayings: the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the parables of the lost sheep, and the mustard seed. Where did this shared material come from? Scholars have hypothesized a lost gospel, a document that no longer exists, but which both Matthew and Luke used as a second source. They call it Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source. Q was likely a simple collection of the teachings of Jesus, circulated in the early church, a greatest hits of the Sermon on the Mount. The existence of Q explains how Matthew and Luke, writing independently, could have such identical word-for-word quotes that didn't come from Mark? And then there is John, the fourth gospel, written last around 90 to 110 CE, is a masterpiece of theology. But it is profoundly different. John does not follow Mark's plot. There are no exorcisms, no parables. Instead, Jesus gives long philosophical speeches known as the I am statements. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The stories are different too. The wedding at Cana, the raising of Lazarus, the washing of the disciples' feet. John is not trying to solve the synoptic problem. He is answering a profound theological question. Who was this man? His answer: he was the Logos, the divine Word of God, made flesh. The Gospels, we find, are not four simple biographies. They are four distinct theological portraits, written by four different authors for four different communities, all based on a complex web of oral and written sources.
But the man who would write more of the New Testament than anyone else, the man who would truly shape the theology of this new faith, was someone who had never met Jesus at all. His name was Paul. Saul of Tarsus, a brilliant, zealous Pharisee who made it his mission to hunt down and destroy the early Christian movement. His blinding conversion on the road to Damascus is the pivot point of Christian history. Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles, a tireless missionary who argued that this Jewish Messiah was for all people.
Between 50 and 65 CE, before any of the Gospels were even written, Paul was writing letters. These are the oldest writings in the New Testament. They are not theological treatises written in a quiet study. They are urgent, passionate, and often angry letters written to real, messy human churches that he had founded. The letter to the Corinthians is a masterclass in pastoral triage, addressing a church rife with divisions, lawsuits, and spiritual arrogance. The letter to the Galatians is a furious, raw defense of his gospel, scolding the church for abandoning its freedom. And the letter to Romans is his masterpiece, a dense, logical, and breathtaking theological argument about faith, sin, and grace that would one day, 1,500 years later, ignite Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation.
But did Paul write all 13 letters attributed to him? Here again, scholars apply literary analysis. They look at vocabulary, writing style, and theological development. There is universal agreement that Paul wrote 7 of the letters: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. These are the undisputed epistles. There is debate about 3 others: Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. The style is different, the sentences longer. Are they from Paul, or perhaps from a brilliant student writing in his name?
The overall tone should be authoritative, inquisitive, and respectful, similar to a high-end historical documentary. Think the BBC, History Channel, or Netflix's Explained series. The New Testament library is almost complete. We have the general epistles, letters from other leaders like James, the brother of Jesus, who argued that faith without works is dead. And finally, we have Revelation. The last book in the canon is not a secret blueprint for the end of the world. It is a classic example of apocalyptic literature, a popular Jewish genre. It was written by a man named John, likely not the apostle, exiled on the island of Patmos as a coded, symbolic, and ferocious critique of the Roman Empire. Babylon the Great was a code word for Rome. The beast, whose number was 666, was a numerical puzzle, a gematria, that spelled out the name of the persecuting emperor Nero Caesar. Revelation was a letter of hope, a political, theological vision assuring persecuted Christians that God, not Caesar, was the true Lord of history.
So we have all these disparate texts, the J, E, D, and P sources, the prophets, the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, the Apocalypse of John. How did these specific books, and no others, end up in one volume called the Bible? This is the story of canonization. Canon is a Greek word meaning measuring stick. The canon is the authoritative list of books that measure up. This was not a single smoke-filled room decision. It was a gradual, organic process that took centuries. The first person to try and create a canon was actually a heretic. In 1444 CE, a wealthy shipowner named Marcion declared that the God of the Old Testament was an angry, inferior God, and that the true, loving God was the Father of Jesus Christ. Marcion created his own Bible, a heavily edited Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. He threw everything else out. This act of heresy forced the mainstream or proto-Orthodox Church to act. They had to define their own canon. The early Church Fathers began to develop a criteria. Apostolic origin? Was it written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? Universal use? Was the book being read, quoted, and used in churches all across the empire, from Rome to Egypt to Syria? Theological coherence? Did it align with the core rule of faith, the emerging consensus about who Jesus was? This process took time. Some books, like Hebrews and Revelation, were debated for centuries. The overall tone, we see a list of the New Testament that matches our 27 books exactly, is in 367 CE, in the Easter festal letter of Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria. This list was debated, but eventually it was formally affirmed by church councils at Hippo in 393 CE and Carthage in 397 CE. The Bible, as a single bound book, was born. But what about the books that didn't make it in? The Lost Gospels. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, an incredible discovery was made: a library of ancient Gnostic texts hidden in a jar for 1,600 years. These were the books that were excluded from the canon: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas. These texts presented a radically different Christianity. Gnosis means knowledge. Gnostics believed salvation came not through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection, but through secret knowledge, gnosis, that he imparted. The Gospel of Thomas is not a narrative. It's a collection of 114 secret sayings of Jesus. The Gospel of Judas portrays Judas not as a traitor, but as the hero who liberated Jesus' spirit from its prison of the physical body. Why were these rejected? Because they failed all three canonical tests. They were not apostolic, they were not universally used, and their core theology, that the physical world is an evil prison, was completely alien to the Jewish worldview of the apostles, who believed in a God who created the world and called it good. We now know who wrote the Bible, a complex collective of authors, editors, and traditions. We know how it was assembled, but this leads to the final 8,000-word question:
how do we know that the book we hold today is anything like what they originally wrote? We don't have the originals. The autographs of Moses, Mark, or Paul are lost to history. What we have are copies of copies of copies. For centuries, scribes copied these texts by hand. They made mistakes. They misspelled words. They skipped lines. They sometimes even added explanatory notes in the margin that a later scribe would mistakenly copy into the main text. So how can we trust it? The answer lies in a remarkable science called textual criticism. Textual criticism is the art of comparing all the available manuscripts to reconstruct the original text. And when we apply this science to the New Testament, we find something astonishing. Let's put this in perspective. For Caesar's Gallic Wars, a foundational text of Roman history, our earliest copy dates 900 years after Caesar lived. We have only about 10 to 20 good manuscripts in total. For Plato's philosophical works, the time gap is over 1,200 years. We have about 200 manuscripts. For the New Testament, we have over 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts. The overall time gap is not 1,000 years. It's a tiny window. The John Rylands Papyrus, a fragment of John's Gospel, is dated by paleographers to around 125 CE, just 30 to 40 years after the original was written. We have entire books like the Bodmer Papyri from 150 to 200 CE. We are, historically speaking, breathing down the necks of the original authors. The overall tone should be authoritative, inquisitive, and respectful, similar to a high-end historical documentary. Like a high-end historical documentary, guiding the viewer through complex academic and theological concepts with ease. Now, skeptics rightly point out that all these manuscripts don't agree. There are an estimated 400,000 variants or differences in the New Testament manuscripts. This number sounds devastating, but it's misleading. The vast majority, perhaps 99%, are completely trivial. Spelling errors, different word orders, or the use of a synonym. They change nothing. Of the remaining variants, only a tiny fraction are both early and significant. For example, the earliest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel end at verse 16:8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb in terror. The longer ending, with Jesus appearing to the disciples, was almost certainly added later. But here is the critical point. Not one of these textual variants, not one of the scribal errors, not one of the debated passages affects any central doctrine of the Christian faith. The core message, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the call to faith and repentance is stable, secure, and undisputed across the entire manuscript tradition. The New Testament is by an exponential margin the best attested, most reliable ancient document on planet Earth.
But what about the Old Testament? Its timeline is thousands of years older. Surely it must have been corrupted. For centuries, this was a valid criticism. Our oldest, most complete copy of the Hebrew Bible was the Leningrad Codex, dated to around 1000 AD. That is a 1,500-year gap from when authors like Isaiah were writing. Skeptics argued that the text must have been hopelessly corrupted over that millennium of copying. And then came the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. In 1947, a shepherd boy looking for a lost goat threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea. He heard a pot shatter. Inside, He and his friends found clay jars stuffed with ancient scrolls hidden by a radical Jewish sect called the Essenes before the Romans destroyed their community in 70 A.D. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls. They contained every single book of the Old Testament, except Esther. And the carbon dating was a bombshell. These scrolls were from 100 to 200 BC. They were 1,000 years older than our previous best manuscript.
The world held its breath. Scholars now had a 1,000-year-old test case. They could compare the Isaiah scroll from 100 BC with the Isaiah scroll from 1000 AD. Had the text been corrupted? The verdict was staggering. The texts were virtually identical. Aside from a few spelling variations and minor scribal slips, the 1,000 years of copying had produced a text that was 99.9% the same. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a stunning, powerful vindication of the accuracy and fidelity of the Jewish scribal tradition.
The archaeological evidence doesn't stop there. For decades, skeptics argued that King David was a myth, a Golden Age figure invented by later priests. In 1993, at Tel Dan in northern Israel, archaeologists found a 9th century BC stone slab, the Tel Dan stele. Erected by an enemy king, it boasts of his victories over the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. There it was, in stone, an enemy attesting to the Davidic dynasty. Skeptics also claim Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who crucified Jesus, was a literary invention. In 1961, at Caesarea, archaeologists unearthed the Pilate stone, a 1st century dedication plaque for a temple. It clearly bears the inscription, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. He was real. The Pool of Siloam, where John's Gospel says Jesus healed a blind man, was lost to history for 2,000 years. In 2004, during a sewage pipe repair, archaeologists uncovered the steps of the 1st century pool exactly as described.
Again and again, archaeology does not prove the Bible's theology, but it does prove that the Bible is not a once-upon-a-time fairy tale. It is a story rooted in real history, real places, and real people. So, who wrote the Bible? A better question is, who didn't? It was written by kings and by shepherds, by priests in exile and by fishermen on a lake, by a doctor in Greece and by a prophet on Patmos. It was written by the Yahwist storyteller, the Elohist dreamer, the Deuteronomist reformer, and the priestly organizer. It is a chorus of human voices wrestling across 1,500 years with the most profound questions of life. Who are we? Why are we here? And is there a God who cares?
Why is it reliable? Its reliability is not that of a 21st century science textbook. Its reliability is of a different, more profound kind. It is reliable in its unparalleled textual preservation, a miracle of transmission that dwarfs every other document from the ancient world. It is reliable in its historical grounding, rooted in a world of genuine kings, verifiable cities, and documented empires, as archaeology continues to confirm. And for billions, it is reliable in its coherent, consistent, and radical message that despite humanity's darkness, redemption is possible, that love is the highest law, and that history is bending toward a just and restored end. The Bible was not faxed from heaven. It is a profoundly human book. It is messy, complex, and written in the blood, sweat, and tears of history. And perhaps that
is the true source of its divine and unbreakable power.
Thank you for joining us on this profound journey. Our investigation doesn't end here. The conversation is just beginning. Now, I have to ask you, what part of the Bible's history do you find most compelling? Is it the documentary hypothesis, the mystery of the Q source, or the stunning discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Let us know in the comments section below. We read every single one. And if you haven't already, please like and share this documentary with someone who loves history. Until next time, walk in truth. God bless you always.